Well, hi, hello, happy Friday, and welcome to Modernizing GitOps from Infrastructure to Apps. Today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Harness and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Jess Steinbach. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm so happy that I get to be your moderator on this lovely Friday because I am very excited to take a deep dive into GitOps, where it all started, and how we have evolved. Now today, with the help of two incredible leading thought experts, we will explore how GitOps began and the journey beyond Kubernetes, right? We will learn about pivotal and leading players in the GitOps ecosystem, discover best practices for enabling deployment and automating sync between Git repositories and live Kubernetes clusters. This is going to be such an interesting conversation. I cannot wait to dive in. So I'm going to get through a few housekeeping points that are going to help you get the most out of your time here together today. And especially if some of you are joining us for the first time, welcome. We're going to take you on a little bit of a tour of your console. If you're joining us for the umpteenth time, maybe you just have a little Friday brain. I'm going to remind you anyways, right? All right, so let's start out with the questions section of your webinar console. Now, this is the best place to get involved, to get interactive, to post all of your insightful questions, your comments, your feedback, your ideas, whatever's rolling around in your head. We want to hear from you. We have a lot planned for you all today, and our speakers want to hear from you as we go through our session. So make sure you're getting those questions in. I saw a bunch of you saying hi. Stephen saying hi to Canada. Yes, I will represent the country of Canada for you. Hey, Ed. Hey, Morteza. We've got Andrew. We've got Steve from Wisconsin. Yeah, the homeland. I love it. Paul, Gilbert, a whole awesome crew here with us. Keep those highs and lows coming. We want to hear from you as we go through our day today. Let us know how your day is going. I will also remind you that that questions window is the best place to reach out to our crew if you do have any issues. Now, a browser refresh is going to get rid of any of the usual tech gremlins, but if they've really got a hold of the system today, no problem. If the browser refresh doesn't work, you're going to post a message in that questions window. Let us know, and our team will be there to help you out. All right, so we started out in the questions tab. We're going to take one hop over to the handouts tab because that handouts tab has some great takeaways and resources for you after we wrap up the webinar today. We've got a lot to cover today, and we're going to get through a ton of information, and you'll want those resources to go back and help kind of jog your memory after we wrap. So make sure you visited that handouts tab. And if all of that wasn't enough to get you pumped up and excited about our day here together today, we also have a $250 Amazon gift card as a prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Now, of course, you do need to be here in live attendance during the webinar in order to qualify to win that prize, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you are not sure what those T's and C's are, don't worry. That handouts tab I was just telling you about, if you click on over and scroll down, you will find the full terms and conditions waiting for you there. All right, let me tell you about another prize here. We have a best question gift card coming at you. That's right. So today, not only does asking a fabulous question mean that we get to have a fabulous conversation, it also enters you to win the best question gift card. That is a $50 Amazon gift card. Now, here's the thing. We review all of the questions asked after we wrap. We're looking at all of the questions that come in, and then we will choose a question from that. So even if we do not get to your question in our live discussion with our wonderful speakers here today, you are still entered to win that best question gift card. So be sure to get those questions in because it's going to get a gold star from me and it enters you to win that best question gift card. All right, well, I said I was going to try to keep things nice and quick and get things moving along. That's because I cannot wait to get our incredible speakers on out here with me. So I am absolutely thrilled to introduce you all to Eric Minnick, Director of DevOps Solutions at Harness, and Martin Ansong, Enterprise Solutions Engineer, also at Harness. Eric and Martin, thank you. I'm so happy to have you both here with me today.
I'm really excited to be here with you. This is such a great topic.
This is going to be really fun. I'm truly looking forward to getting into this conversation. Eric, can I start things out, though, with flipping that question around to you? What are you excited? What makes you look forward to unpacking this conversation today?
I think GitOps is such a kind of vibrant space right now. It's really exciting. You know, I talk to so many people and they look at it and they're like, yes, this is how we should be doing deployments. This feels great. And they get into it, and in some ways, they're a little worse than they were in the past. In some ways, they're a lot better. So we want to look at that and see if we can get all the good stuff and leave the bad stuff behind.
I love it. I'm thrilled. Okay, I'm going to hand things over to you. You guys take it away. I'm here with you.
All right. Now, this will be good. And I'll be kind of talking through this from the background of someone who's been in the DevOps space for 20 years. That's why I don't have hair. And then leaning on Martin, who's spending a lot more time these days with our customers and users who are implementing GitOps. And I don't know, Martin, you've probably worked with dozens of customers at this point who are doing GitOps and CD kind of stuff. Yeah. All right. So he'll be the smart guy. All right. Let's get into it. So structure-wise, and you see people in the background. Martin's over at KubeCon today. Just got out of the Argo Day with all the good GitOps portion of that. So we've got someone live from the cutting edge right now. So agenda, we're going to cover some basics for those of you who don't know a lot about GitOps. Then we'll hit where we see some challenges, how you get around those challenges. We'll talk about different layers of the stack, how infrastructure and application come together in this world. Then as an example for how this all works, Martin will give us a demo, and then we'll break for Q&A. If I can keep an eye on the questions coming in, I'll try to tackle questions as we go. That's always a bit of a challenge. We'll go for it, though. All right, let's get into it. So I think today we're in a world where everything is code, right? We see pipelines as code, policy as code, infrastructure as code, right? All of our stuff is increasingly in code. And code has a place it lives. These days it's Git. I mentioned I've been doing this a while. When I started, there were like a dozen source control systems that people used. Now it's all different flavors of Git. This is pretty simple and consistent these days. We have code for all the things. It lives in Git. And that leads to GitOps, right? And there's a lot of misconceptions about GitOps, and people use GitOps in a number of different ways. But generally, we agree on 4 core principles. That GitOps should be declarative, right? That I should have a file that says that the right configuration for my environment is these things, and that configuration should be versioned, right? And that I can just look at that configuration and make the environment, make the workload look that way. So if at any point I have a copy of this file, I should be able to have that thing. That's what we mean by versioned and immutable. And then the changes should be automated, right? Moving from that definition to having the thing actually running, there's a machine that does all that work for me. I'm not doing any of the deployment fiddling along the way. And then there's a reconciliation aspect where we say, if I have a definition and I have it running and someone changes a thing that's running, it should be automated how that's noticed, and then how we go back to that declaration of here's what should be going, right? So that's the rough structure. And then from a workflow perspective, what we see is that you typically have a developer change that file, and then somebody else is going to review that. And because this is all working in Git, that review is through a pull request or a merge request, whatever you call that in your particular flavor of Git, where you do a code review and then you accept that new version into the mainline. So there you're storing it back into Git, and it's into the right place in Git, where some sort of GitOps agent, some reconciler, is watching that area. It'll observe that comes in, kick off the deployment or the change into the environment, so that the environment now looks like what the definition file says. It'll then continue to observe that environment so that if it drifts off the desired state, it can be reconciled back. So that's the basics. Martin, I see you nodding. What did I miss talking through that?
No, I think you've touched on all the key points there.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got it about right. So you got a file, and then there's some automation that makes the environment look like that. All right. And this does some really good things for us. And they're all equally valuable, so they're all number one. This idea of it being declarative and deterministic means that you're always saying, here's what I want, and you get that. You're not having as many unintended changes, right? If we're doing really incremental fiddling, right, the incremental fiddling could be dependent on something that wasn't done yet, and we get a mess. We also know that for developers, Git is a place they're used to working, and working with YAML files feels right, especially when you're working in Kubernetes, right? Like this just seems like the right way to Kubernetes. And then because Git has a history of both who made the change and who approved the change through the pull request, you get a good audit trail, right? Who changed it, who approved the change. That feels good. And then drift is the most annoying thing in the world, and we get to prevent it because we have the continuous reconciliation. So when I've talked to people who are into GitOps and want to adopt it, some I think are doing it because it's the cool new thing. But most are doing it because they like one or more of these things. And I honestly feel like the natural interface is probably the most compelling part for the individual practitioner. And then they tell their boss that it's about drift. But depending on where you are in the stack, all of these things are valuable. Martin, are there other things that you're seeing that are driving people to adopt GitOps?
Yeah, I think some of it is also to do with scale, especially for large enterprises, especially when it comes to things like bootstrapping, different environments. For most people, it's probably a lot easier just to have one source of truth and have that scale out.
Here's how we build our clusters. Here's what they look like.
Precisely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. So I think this gets into the stack. At the lowest level, when we're thinking about infrastructure, here we're looking at infrastructure as code. And we're using tools like OpenTofu, Terraform, those sorts of things to build out that base level of infrastructure. So often, if I want to create a new cluster, I'm going to do that with something like Terraform, particularly if I'm going to do something like provision VMs and then create a cluster on top of it. Then there's this idea of the application, right? And how I move the application onto that infrastructure through the environments that run on that infrastructure as well. And here in the Kubernetes world, which is where I think we see most of the GitOps these days, ArgoCD and FluxCD are the common reconciliation agents. Right? That happens pretty often. And then I think there's a layer in between, right? There's the configuration of the cluster, as Martin was talking about. And that would be typically done by Argo, right? Particularly the detailed capabilities there, or Flux. You're going to use your GitOps reconciliation for that. Could be done by the lower level. So you've got a little bit of ambiguity there because you've got the infrastructure as code and the application as code. All of this should be wrapped by some sort of policy, right? So here you're going to have things like OPA, the Open Policy Agent, or what's the other one? Cavanero. Pronunciation.
Kyverno.
Kyverno.
Yeah.
Yes. So you get this layer trying to say, here are the approved ways of doing these things, and making sure that the new definition files and infrastructure as code can be applied correctly and meets our standards. So Martin's saying, hey, we're going to have our standard thing in Git, but then if somebody changes it, did they do something really silly? Let's try to detect that and block that. Policy is a big part of that. Cool. All right. Well, I don't see any questions yet, so I'm either making great sense or I have confused you all so badly. All right. Oh, no, Gilbert's asking some questions, so that's great. What's the best way to describe it to management with the selling points? Drift. I think so. Like when I'm talking to management, I'm going to tend to talk in terms of risk, right? I might talk in terms of speed and productivity as well. So I think saying, this is a very consistent way of doing this, and I know I'm going to have the environment the way I want it to be, and there's going to be a safety net that's going to keep it that way. That's how I would talk about GitOps to management if I'm trying to sell the idea. They don't particularly care whether there's a YAML file or whether it lives in Git. They might care that there's a good audit trail. Right? Martin, is there anything else you'd add if you were talking to someone's boss?
Yeah, I think drift is a very good one because most management care mostly about risk and how to easily remediate that. So as long as they understand the value of that, then it's a lot easier to sell to the business, I would say.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at some of the challenges around this. And we're going to go back to that same diagram we used earlier and point out some places where this gets tricky. So in a vanilla GitOps implementation, every promotion would require a developer to open a pull request and usually a different developer to review and approve it. That's what we described at the start. Now, when I think about software delivery, we often do things like I deploy to my first test environment and I run some automated tests. And if those pass, maybe I deploy to my second test environment where we do some longer tests or some manual tests. There's not an interesting decision there for that promotion, right? We don't need people to evaluate anything, right? I ran the test. Did they pass? If they did, let's promote. That should be fully automated. And it's often not. And so compared to, let's say, traditional pipeline automation, you might have some extra manual labor with vanilla GitOps. Then you've got this idea of the validation, right? So if the tests ran, and those include security scans and linting, and our policy might be written down in a Confluence page or a help us SharePoint page. We have to then review all the output from our tools, compare that to our policy, and use that to decide whether we should promote or not. That's annoying. And that can feel like a step back from other technologies. That gets into the security and the scans as we go. So once I do my deployment, what happens next, right? If I deploy a test, I want to then run my tests. Your basic GitOps open source layer, your Argos or Terraform, are very focused on changing the environment. They're not as focused on how do I run all my scans and tests and things like that. So you can script it. These are automation tools, don't get me wrong. You're smart engineers, you can script whatever you want. But it's additional labor compared to how you might have done it pre-GitOps. Come back to that reviewer, coming back to the validation. And then once you go out to production, how do you know it's working out there, right? You have to then check, is this environment healthy? Are my users delighted by the content? Is it performing like it was before? Are my error rates in line with what we normally expect? All of that, you still have to kind of do that manual inspection. And then if it's not what you want, you have to open a pull request, and then probably somebody else has to approve the pull request to make a rollback happen, right? And you're typing in individual versions half the time. Maybe you're just going to a prior version in Git and saying, bring it back. So there's some things here that are, I don't know, how would you describe it, Martin? I'd say like janky at best.
Yeah, and I think one other thing these tools don't take into account is when you're doing a software deployment or delivery, there are other components you've got to take into account, like things like database changes, external systems that you might need to test against. And your traditional algo tools are very good at, like, let's say, a pinpoint delivery and rollback, but they don't take into account all the other factors that make up your software delivery.
Yep. All right. So the lesson I've taken away from kind of examining this is that there's a lot of really good stuff about a declarative approach. But a lot of the imperative stuff we had in pipeline automation didn't go away after the deployment, run the test. If all the tests pass, let's automatically promote. A lot of those things stayed, and we need to marry up the declarative way of saying, here's what I want in the environment, and keep it that way, with those automation layers that we had in pipelines before. So GitOps needs a pipeline. If you're going to take one thing away from this, I think GitOps needs a pipeline. So this gets into from build to deploy. Let's automatically do those promotions when it's obvious when the tests pass. And then because this is GitOps and everything has to go through Git, the pipeline has to play nice with Git, right? You are going to use your pipeline to open and close pull requests. All right. Doing that will help us address the extra work from auto promotion if our pipeline opens the pull request to auto promote after it sees that the test pass, right? And it helps us address the more than just deployment issue of running security tests and scans. Pipelines are really good at saying, oh, deployment completed, now I'll go do this next thing. Okay. Super easy for it. All right, next part. Pre-flight checks, all right, being careful. So when the PR is opened, we can run some static checks, right? So if this is Terraform and someone opens a PR changing Terraform and an S3 bucket is set as public, we can just say no, right? Like it's pretty clear that that's not a safe choice. So if we ran a security scan, it said that's really dangerous, then we could automate closing the PR in a rejected fashion. We can figure out how price impacts. And then if we've got policies, we can make sure the policy as code is evaluated at this stage. And before we ask any engineers to review the change, we can make sure that the change complies with our organizational standards. This is the objection your boss is going to give when you say you want to do GitOps things. And this is how to address it, right? You layer the stuff on top. All right. Then we've got the pull request aspect. This is another thing that we want to deal with. We are asking developers to review a change by looking at diffs in code. That doesn't have the results of the tests attached with it. It doesn't have the security scan, all of the cost implications of things. So the more of these pre-flight checks that we can bring that context back to the pull request, the better. Right. At minimum, if we can have a link from the pull request out to our pipeline that did all these things, then it's at least easy to do the checking. If we write it down in the PR itself, even easier. So let's make sure that the developer who has to review the change has the context they need so that we can address that issue number 4 where they don't have that context. And then we need to streamline rollback, right? I mean, maybe you guys are smarter than me and none of your deployments ever go sideways. Right? That'd be great. But when I've been doing this in my life, some percentage of deployments go sideways because the app isn't working and our tests weren't thorough enough and all that good stuff. So let's make it as easy as possible to detect that the deployment isn't great and then roll it back. Right. So we'll need some sort of capability around that to make our lives easier. All right. So that was 5 things. Anything else you'd add to that one, Martin?
I'd say maybe a key one as well is visibility, because not every engineer is going to be as au fait with playing around with YAML or CRDs. You also have to take into account the business, because from their perspective, kind of GitOps is a bit of an abstract idea for them. So having that visibility that everyone can go to and say, okay, we know precisely where in the chain our application is, definitely brings value there.
Yeah. And, you know, for someone like me, right, who's like a retired developer, I don't want to go figure out like how QA is different than prod by pulling files out of 2 different Git repos and diffing them. Like, I want something that says like version 1.2 is in QA and 1.3 is in prod. I'm going to hope that actually the QA number is higher than the prod number. But yeah, we want it that simple, right? And I think as you scale GitOps, you can often have multiple controllers running around, and finding what's where can be really hard. So I think that observability, that visibility is really key. All right. So let's dive into this down at the app and the infrastructure layers. So I think we talked mostly about app. And when people think about GitOps, they're mostly thinking about something like Argo and Flux managing Kubernetes. Increasingly, we're seeing the same gestures and the same general workflow applied to things like infrastructure as code, right? So for those of you who aren't as familiar with how infrastructure as code work, you've got a developer who's writing a infrastructure as code document, like in Terraform or HCL technically. And then you run a plan which predicts what's going to change when you do this, when you make this happen. And then apply says, go make my cloud look like my plan, right? So the configuration gets saved. We run a plan that compares the real infrastructure to that. And now we know what we're going to change. When we do the apply, that actually does that work. We also have an idea of state, which is our copy of what we think the cloud looks like. Okay. So same sort of challenges here in infrastructure as code. You're often having these changes triggered by an application developer. A lot of the policy work and some of the expertise around Terraform lives with cloud engineers. That disconnect can be really tricky. Knowing when we're doing a pull request about things like cost, right? Did someone just say, I want 4 servers with giant GPUs in them for their HR application that has no AI in it, right? Let's detect that and say, oh, this is going to be a gajillion dollars a month. Maybe we shouldn't. And then while we have a plan, we're just going to get some documents out, but the impact of that is really hard, right? Are we creating new servers, destroying new servers? What's going on there? So when we're thinking about GitOps with infrastructure as code, we're going to keep that pipeline concept we were talking about earlier, where we have an infrastructure as code pipeline that handles a lot of the interaction with the configuration, right? So the developer can make their change, and then the pipeline will do things like say, okay, we have a new version of this file. Let's do our linting. Let's run security scans that are infrastructure as code centric, whether that's a commercial tool like Wiz or a Chekhov or TFSec. We can go make those checks and with the scanning, and then based on that, we can approve the change. And depending on your organization, the approval might be going back into the pull request, and done by a fellow engineer, or it might be done by your manager who looks at the output of all of this stuff and needs it clearly described in managerese, right? Like we're doing 3 things and the cost is not going to change, right? Then we can run our apply. So we take this pipeline concept, we bring it to infrastructure as code, and we're in a much better place. I was rambling for a while. Martin, did that make sense? Anything you'd add to all this?
No, I think it's pretty spot on.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Cool. And then application tier. One of the common kind of manual GitOps things that we see is that you've got some build tool that does your build. Then the person is creating the pull request. We're seeing the tests run somehow. That can be a little tricky. Same with security scans. And then a person is again reviewing the output of all of that and creating the new pull request for approval to deploy to stage. And then the actual moving of the bits is done by something like Argo. Martin, we were talking yesterday. You've seen some other patterns where people kind of build their own automation around this?
Yeah, so a lot of what I've seen would be like a Slack bot, where it's just to try and make it easy for developers to kind of go in and try and promote an image to a new environment. I've seen people script most of this as well. So those are the kind of main ones I've seen.
Yeah, there's people realize pretty quickly, I need some sort of orchestration or automation, and they build it somehow, whether it's in whatever CI/CD tool they have laying around, or in Slack, or just some scripts. We know the developers are smart and can automate things with things. It's not always the best way to do it. So I think what we'd suggest is, again, taking that pipeline approach so that when the PR comes in, that gets picked up by your pipeline tool, which says, okay, let's do this deployment to dev. And then Argo will go do the actual deployment again. But then your pipeline is what runs the tests, runs your security scans, and reviews all of that stuff, right? And says, oh, there's no new security issues. The tests are going fine. I can open the PR to go on to the next environment. Maybe I approve my own PR if you want it to do that way, or we send it back to the team to make that decision. But at least it's one person who has to click a button instead of several. And then we can send information out to the team about that, again, with like a Slack integration or something to say, yep, new version went to the dev test environment. It worked great, right? Something like this is what we recommend. All right. And then the third layer that we wanted to talk about was where policies come in. You have some kind of policies, and here are some policies that we're using around feature flags, which in Harness can also use GitOps gestures. So you might say my feature flag has to go to QA before it goes to production. You'd say the same thing for your applications. Even if someone says, I want to deploy my new version to prod, if it never went through QA, you should be able to detect that and say, look, we should probably test things before we give them to our customers. Go to QA first. Your PR is rejected. So this sort of approach where you do policy as code is really great. We're big fans of OPA for that. That's written in a language called Rego. Some people don't know Rego. We offer a little CodeGen widget in the tool to help you write your Rego based on plain English. All right. And then whatever the policy stuff is, it needs to be really obvious to people who are approving, like big red things about whether you succeeded or failed on your policy evaluations. So if you're approving in a UI, as a traditional person, maybe your manager likes that, then it needs to be big and red in a UI. if all your approvals are going through Git, because you're all in on GitOps, then into the PR needs to be really clear explanations about why the PR was rejected or why we think the other engineer should reject it. So we want to make that as clear as possible. All right. So that's a couple layers of the stack. I showed like 2 screenshots there and a lot of little guys, little icons of people doing work and icons of tools and stuff. So I think to make it a little more concrete, why don't you take us through a little bit of a demo, Martin? Just show them how we do it in our tooling, and that might give them inspiration for how they want to do it.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is just walk you through a simple demo. In this instance, what we're doing is we're going to build an artifact. So we've built an application called guestbook with our tag, and we're going to deploy it through different environments. So within our build phase, obviously, we create our tag, we build our application, and we're able to scan that as well. And once that's all successful, we can go straight into our dev environments. And the way we're doing that is the first thing we're going to do is update our release repo. So what Harness would do is create a pull request. So if we have a look at that pull request, I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it, Eric? Or is it just the one?
I see just the one view. I don't see Git.
Okay. I'll try this again.
Pretty sure telephony and screen shares are the hardest part of all of IT. GitOps is easy. All right, so now we're seeing slides again.
Okay, let's try window share. Okay, we'll just go through this and see how that works. But yeah, effectively what we're doing is we'll create a pull request for you. And then we have the ability to have an approval. So once the pull request has been created, you can even have intermediary steps here before the approval gate. So you can have a thermal environment spin up, run some tests against that, and then someone comes in here and hits approved. Once that's approved, what we're going to do is walk through a merge. Once we've merged that, we're then able to sync the application and then run external tests against it. And so as a user, you can quickly come in here and see what's happening without having to be au fait with ArgoCD or Flux CRDs or know what's going on. And then once those tests are successful, so in this case, sorry, go on.
I was going to say I don't have to watch the log the whole time and get a pretty picture.
No. Once this is done, you can also just have a notification that's sent off to a user and then come back into the pipeline. Once that's done, we just automatically then move into our QA environment and we run a similar set of steps in there where we fetch the application, sync the application. And then when we're done, again, what we could do is we could have an approval gate in here. The useful thing about having this as well, or within Harness, is the ability to have policies. So for example, I could have had policies that would make sure I'm having an approval between my QA and prod, because typically you wouldn't do that. Then when we move into our prod environment, again, a similar set of steps that we're doing. So again, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. But what's going to happen here is that we're going to fail based on the smoke test. And within Harness, you have the ability to roll back very easily. So I'll wait for that to happen. So let's say in this case, our smoke test has failed. We're able to revert the pull requests straight away and then merge that pull request all within the pipeline as well. So you don't have to go around trying to fetch different files and see what's happening there. If I quickly edit this pipeline, you can see that the rollback step is something you can configure. So I can even add a bunch of other steps in there, whether they're Kubernetes related. I can even bring in things like Terraform, CloudFormation, etc. I can run custom utility scripts as well, etc. And then once this application has been deployed, if I want to see an overview of what this looks like, what I do is I'll just go to the service definition for my service which I've deployed. So in this case, this is my guestbook UI, which I've deployed. And so from a business perspective, what I can see here is for dev, I have 2 instances running at this version. For QA, I have 2 instances running at this version. And then for prod as well. In this case, this is the last failure, so I can even go straight ahead and look at that. And then finally, we can also see the resources for this application that I deployed. So if I go to my application view, and then I go into one of the applications I've deployed, let's say in QA, I get a pretty good view of the resource. And you can see we updated that pod 2 minutes ago. So that's it for the demo.
If I'm objecting as a developer, I'm going to say that looked like it was all drag and drop. Is there code back there too?
Yeah, so everything you saw in there is defined as YAML. We have extensive APIs which allow you to create that programmatically. And we also have a Terraform provider, so you could even write all of that in Terraform.
Cool. All right. And then that lives in Git too. And then we had some approvals in there that were like native in Harness. I'd say that what we see is that a lot of teams are using kind of the engineer level approval through the pull request process in their lower environments, but management hasn't become entirely convinced about that for production releases of important applications. And so they still want something somewhere else, whether that's in a tool like ours or out in ServiceNow. So figuring out how much you're going to be allowed to do a GitOps approval process to do the governance and for which apps, I think is really relevant as you're coming up with a strategy. Because we see a lot where it's like, for production, you still have to do it out in your ITSM tool. So you're going to need to bridge to that somehow. All right. Cool. All right. Well, let's move to Q&A. So shoot us more questions. That'd be great. We've got a couple now. So, Martin, do you have a suggestion for Gilbert who asks, what's the best way to get started in GitOps as a beginner?
Yes, I mean, there's quite a few tools out there that you can kind of spin up locally and try. And it's probably best as like trying out with a simple application and then seeing how far you can get with that. Yeah.
Probably start on like one of the tiers. So just like, how do I do GitOps in Kubernetes, and I'm going to use Argo to deploy a simple app?
Yeah, like a simple Nginx, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, not even a custom app. Just something off the shelf.
Yeah.
Paul asks, or you want to pick one?
Sorry, they're just kind of flying. Someone asked, what API tie-ins does the platform support? We have REST APIs, so pretty much any entity within the platform has an API endpoint to it, hence why we have a Terraform provider. Does that answer that question, Andrew?
Okay. And then Paul was asking about, the agent and controller concept. Like, how do we actually get some automation happening out in the Kubernetes cluster? What's doing the work? How are we reaching to it? Is that something that you're good to expand on?
Yeah. So the pipeline I showed you still uses an agent. And so the way Harness functions is you can kind of bring in your own pre-existing ArgoCD agents and have Harness as a kind of control plane for it. Or the example I showed you effectively just uses one agent and then deploys to the other clusters using something like a service account token. And so in that sense, your overhead for managing agents, it's reduced significantly.
Yep. We'll take care of all your Argo instances and keep them tidy. That makes sense. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. Jess, I don't know if you are, but if not.
Well, we've got a few more questions. They're hiding from you. We've got a few scrolls in here. So I do want to ask you one more at least. I know we're a little short on time, but I'm going to try to sneak in one or two more. Keep you in the hot seat a bit longer. This one actually I'm excited about. We did get some questions from folks that are kind of looking ahead into the next year. So I'm wondering, I'm going to kind of consolidate a few questions from the audience here. If we were thinking about like the top thing that the folks should have in mind or sort of be watching for in terms of trends as we go into 2025, what do you guys think? What's your top prediction? I'm asking you to be oracles.
No, clearly AI is GitOps. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say more like AI agents and how they work within the context of a pipeline. So a lot of what I'm seeing, especially at KubeCon now, is let's say a build fails, instead of a user going through the logs, just having AI summarize that for them. And some of the things Harness has coming along would be things like a QA assistant, having something that helps you write tests very quickly, or even being able to build pipelines using AI. I think that would be a big trend for the next year.
Yeah, and I think as we have so many services these days and so many moving pieces as we've kind of moved to distributed clusters and all this stuff, it's very difficult to create and manage and debug all of the pipelines across a massive organization. And how we've seen this play out is that increasingly we ask developers to do more and more, right? Because we have a lot of them. And then they get less and less innovation done. And then we yell at them and say, code faster. Like that's not great. So finding these things like, how do I create a pipeline? I have an error. Like, what actually happened here? Explain it to me so I can go fix it real quick. Or maybe you can fix it yourself, Mr. AI, who works in my DevOps tool chain, right? Those sorts of things will kind of counteract this overloading developers trend that we're seeing so much, take the toil off them and let them get back to delivering the innovation that is much more satisfying than fiddling with the pipeline.
I love that. And I think there's a lot of people out in the audience kind of applauding along with that. Like, please stop overloading. We're down to our final minutes. I'm going to sneak in one more question. We did get a couple of questions about compliance. Is there anything else that you want to add around like how this does or doesn't work or might help augment in compliance industries that have high levels of compliance?
Yeah, and I think those are the ones where we see like, oh, can you please do the approval in service now? And you've got a bridge between these two worlds. Long term, the engineers who understand the application best are probably the best ones to approve a change to the application. That said, they need to have the context, right? Again, we can't burden them with reading every line of the governance policies, with reviewing every detail of every scan and test and all of that. A central team can define those policies, and that can be evaluated in a very automated fashion against the output of the scans, against the contents of the change, against whether it's Friday afternoon and maybe we don't do deployments on Friday afternoons. That can all be automated, right? Mm-hmm. And then the context for the developer is, hey, is this new version ready, right? Do we believe in it after all these scans worked? And then you've actually done all of the checks that are required to be highly compliant because you baked in all those policies, you built them into your pipeline. It's all there. You just don't need a meeting with a bunch of people who don't understand what's going on and to give it a thumbs up, right? Like this helps us move on from compliance theater to compliance that's fast. So I get up in arms about this sort of stuff. So I love that question. I don't know if you want to add anything to it, Martin.
No, I mean, most of the customers I work with are regulated industries. And I think that's one of the big things where the centralized team are able to write these policies. And then they're not having to fight with the applications teams. It is what it is. And so from the applications team, all they have to care about is build my application and make sure it gets to the next stage whilst adhering to these policies. You know?
And I think we're seeing that it's working, it's taking hold. I mean, what we saw with GitOps a couple of years ago is if we looked at one of these big regulated firms, they'd have a couple of teams working on not necessarily the most sensitive projects, doing GitOps stuff, right? Mm. Kind of cutting edge learning lab sort of things, maybe a marketing application that wasn't touching people's credit cards. Today, we're starting to see those same organizations rolling it out to hundreds of applications, and even thousands of applications are moving on to GitOps. So we're kind of moving out of that super early adopter, cutting edge only world to the beginnings of kind of majority use. Like normal people are using GitOps workflows, but they have to build this extra automation around it to smooth it out.
Well, I think that's both a wonderful and terrible place to leave it. Terrible because I feel like we just opened whole other doors that I would love to walk through with both of you and continue to explore. But a wonderful place to leave it because I think you've given us a lot to think about and definitely walked us through sort of the evolution to where we're going next, which is really exciting. Before I let you guys go, though, I want to ask you, and Eric, I'm going to ask you what we should do if we want to learn more about Harness, if we want to kind of get started and jump in.
Scan the QR code.
How easy! Look at that.
Where we can connect. We're very happy to, talk to you and walk you through the product in a lot more detail. Someone like Martin will do that. Or if you want to try it yourself, you can sign up, use it for free on a small scale today if you want.
Well, I love that. And Martin, any final thoughts from you today?
No, nothing else to add.
Perfect. Well, first of all, Martin, I want to say thank you for joining us from the middle of a conference. Anyone who has spent time at a conference knows how hard it is to find a quiet place, and certainly a place to be focused and offer, insightful thoughts as you have. So I have to give you a little extra gold star for that, and really thank you. Eric, thank you so much for leading us through this conversation. I feel like you took all the heavy lifting of moderating out of my role. I just got to sit back and absorb, which was fantastic. So I, like the audience, have very much enjoyed this ride, and I want to thank both of you for that.
This is a pleasure. Thanks to everybody for attending. I hope you get the $50 and the $250.
That's it. Yeah, there's 2 chances to win. Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Eric. All right. And as Eric mentioned, prizes coming up, but I do want to say, make sure you've got that QR code scanned and visit the handouts tab. If you haven't already done that, make sure you spend some time in the handouts tab. There's some great takeaways there. There's a definitive guide to continuous delivery, some really cool follow-ups. We talked about this and I was saying this at the end. I really mean it. I feel like we opened a bunch of doors and there's just so many more doors that I want to walk through with these guys. There was so much that we covered. So one great way to make sure that you can get a bit of additional information is to scan the QR code and visit the handouts tab. So make sure you do those two things. Now, also, if you have any burning questions that are still rolling around in your head, get them into the questions window. I know that we didn't get to all your questions. I can see them there. And we did our best. We had a lot to cover. But if you get those questions in still, we will make sure that you get answers from Harness. So make sure you're still asking, make sure that you're still sending those questions in because Harness will get back to you. So you will get responses back to all of those. All right. Well, that was a lot of information for a Friday afternoon. I hope your brains are feeling sparkly and lit up and ready to roll into the weekend. And speaking of sparkle, I have one more piece of excitement for all of you. We have a $250 Amazon gift card, and that is going to someone who is here live and present at the webinar and a little bit lucky. And that special someone on this lovely, lovely day is Paul Sherrill from Washington. Paul Sherrill of Washington. Congratulations to you, Paul. We will get in touch about claiming your prize after we wrap. And as Eric just said, there's also that $50 best question gift card. And again, we are looking at all the questions asked after we wrap. So the competition was pretty fierce today. Well done. High fives to all of you for asking some great questions. Keep those coming in. Still a chance to win there. All right, well, with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to once again thank Harness for making this webinar possible, especially to our wonderful speakers here with us today, Eric and Martin. You have both given us so much to think about. I love when we get to sort of story tell around something that we think about a lot, maybe we think we understand, and then we get to shift our context a little bit, deepen that understanding a little bit, and maybe take it in a slightly new direction. I think Eric and Martin gave us a lot to kind of think about and take away. So on that note, my biggest high fives, my biggest thank yous, all my shiniest gold stars go to all of you out there with us today for taking time out of your day to join in this conversation. I know how crazy the week can get and everything's just going and going and going. And on a Friday, it can be hard to make space in your day or you're just brain dead. And all of you took the time today to come and participate in this conversation and ask some really great questions and learn. So you are the reason that we are here today. You are what makes all of this possible. And so as always, my biggest gratitude is to all of you here for coming to make my day so wonderful and to wrap up the week on such a wonderful note. So thank you for that. I hope that I'll get to see all of you at a webinar again soon. And until then, well, have an absolutely beautiful end to your day and your week. Thanks all.